those of you who are observant or notice these sorts of things or care may notice that I'm wearing a different shirt and tie from when this lecture began. The explanation is that we had a technical problem with the camera in the middle of the lecture, somewhere through the lecture, yesterday, and so we had to stop, and then we have to start again today. And not 100% sure where I was. We tried to figure it out, so there may be a little bit of a disconnect here, but let me just explain to you what I was trying to talk about. I was trying to explain to you the main point was that by the 1820s, most Americans are pretty comfortable with the way things are in terms of slavery. It's sort of accepted that northern states don't have slavery, southern states do. That's been sort of the reality. And there was, as I told you, a very clear line. I mean, this is not just some vague thing of north versus south and what's north, what's north. There's an actual line that defines the difference between slave states and non-slave states. And it's legal. All states north of the line are not allowed to have slavery. Slavery is allowed in all states south of the line. And the line is, if you remember, it starts on the east coast and in the eastern states, the original 13 states. It's the Mason-Dixon line. Then that goes up to the sort of the Appalachian Mountains. And then the area west of that we acquired from Britain, that's the sort of the first addition of territory to this country. Within that area, the Mason-Dixon line sort of, it kind of jogs a little bit. It isn't a perfect alignment, but it sort of goes to where the Ohio River starts, and then it follows down the Ohio River, and there the Northwest Ordinance, north of it, said there would be no slavery, and the understanding was that slavery would be allowed south of that line. And then that carried us up to the Mississippi, and it carried to the territory that we had at that time, as of the 1780s, when we became independent. That was our national boundary. Then when we acquired the Louisiana Territory, now we had to decide, eventually, we had to decide what we were going to do without slavery in that area. And the decision on that was the Missouri Compromise, which extended the line. And again, it jogs a little bit from, if you follow the Ohio down to the Mississippi, and then you kind of have to jiggle a little bit to get up to the southern border of the state of Missouri, which is the geographic line 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. And that line then was extended out to the territory of the Louisiana Purchase, the territory that we had as of 1820, and we'd had since 1803. And so there then, the assumption was, or the agreement was, that Missouri Compromise was that Missouri would be north of that line and Missouri would become a slave state, but the rest of the territory, when it was eventually ready for statehood, and who knows how long that's going to be, but over years we're gradually going to add those new states, and the ones that are north of that line would be non-slave, the ones south of it would be slave, although really, if you look at it, there's only going to be, well, two states south of it. One of them was, well, Louisiana was already a state, and Oklahoma has been reserved for the Indians, as we talked about. But so it really only leaves what would become Arkansas. That's only one state left to go in that territory south of Missouri. All the rest of it is going to become non-slave. But as I told you, the South agreed to that as part of the compromise. They got the short-run gain of having the slave state Missouri, and the long-term gain went to the north, in that eventually all of those other states would become non-slave states. But this is sort of a dividing line. We've divided the country in half, or not really in half, but close to it, and decided that north of that we're not going to have slavery, south of that we will. And reinforcing that was the fact that slavery becomes more and more closely tied to cotton. Slaves were used for all kinds of other activities. Slaves were used in the older areas of the South, or slaves were still being used in tobacco and cotton and sugar. But increasingly, slavery becomes identified with cotton. Of course, cotton was not available until the 1790s, but it has become available, and more slavery and cotton are sort of tied together. And cotton can only grow in the South. As a matter of fact, it can't even grow in all of those southern states. It's only in the southern part of the South that cotton can grow, but that means that cotton is limited to there by natural factors, and so slavery is more or less limited to that area, and that makes people comfortable. It's okay, everybody's satisfied with that, and that's kind of a reasonable compromise or reasonable settlement of this issue. Now I was talking about people, though, who did not accept that compromise. People in the North who considered slavery wrong for whatever reason. Either many of them were motivated by religion, many of them were Christians who felt that the message of Christianity was that Christ was the Savior of all people. There were people who were motivated by political considerations. There are people who are motivated by what we might call ideological considerations. The United States is a country where all men are created equal. People had different reasons, but there were people who did not accept slavery or did not approve of it. But as I was saying, for most of them, there's no solution. They can't accept, one, that black people are the same as white people and that we can just live together. So that meant, okay, we could free the slaves, but then what do we do with them? And for that, they had no answer, because they can't accept the fact that, well, what we do is not a big deal. We just live together. No, most Americans could not accept that simple answer because of their innate racism. And the other sort of problem for which there's no solution is slaves are property. So you've got to compensate the owners. You can't take away their property. And that was what was the end of the line for most people who would not approve of slavery. Most people who were not comfortable with that compromise. Most people are, but within the people who are comfortable, there are some who did not accept slavery. But they couldn't go anywhere with it. They didn't know what to do, so they just sort of dropped the issue. It's just sort of like, I don't think we should have slavery. Yeah, well, what are you going to do with the slaves? I don't know. And how are you going to deal with the fact that they're property? I don't know. So it's just a dead issue. Now, there are, that maybe most of you have figured out, there are solutions to those two problems. For the problem of what do you do with the slaves, one answer is you relocate them. So there were all kinds of ideas that are circulating among people who don't like slaves. They came up with all kinds of areas where we could relocate the slaves so that they could have their place to live and white people could be the people of the United States. So there were ideas about relocating them out to the West. That's something that's a real obvious solution. There were ideas about relocating them to the slave territories of the Caribbean or Brazil. Those are basically slave communities, so we could relocate slaves from the United States there. Or the most popular idea is to relocate them back to Africa. So that's a solution. Then we just relocate the slaves to Africa. And this question of why they're property, well, so you pay the owners. You just compensate the owners. You can take property from people as long as you compensate the owners. So let's just do that. Both of those ideas also ran aground and had a hard time going anywhere because of the costs involved. Yeah, we could relocate the slaves, but how much is it going to cost? And when you look at the numbers, you start crunching numbers and figure out how much it's going to cost to relocate millions of people, whether it be out to the West, and then what do you do with the Indians, whether it be to relocate them to Africa, whatever. It's just going to cost way too much money. And compensating the owners, well, again, you just look at numbers, you look at how many slaves there are, you look at what the price of each slave is going to be, and they won't all have the same price, but look at what the prices are going to be, and then you start adding it up, and the numbers are just out of sight. It's just impossible. Despite that, there were Americans who proceeded in the 1810s and the 1820s to relocate slaves. There was an organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society. Didn't have very many members, but it had people who cared deeply about this, and some of them had a little bit of money. And what they did was to essentially buy some slaves from some of the owners in the South and then relocate them to Africa at private expense. You know, this is something that private individuals are doing at their own expense. And so this is what's going on a very limited scale, but there was some activity to deal with slavery in the 1820s, 18 teens, and 1820s, where Americans were relocating slaves to Africa. And they established a nation for the returned slaves that still exists today, the modern-day nation of Liberia. Liberia was a country established by anti-slave Americans in the 1820s, and they relocated people there. They relocated freed slaves whom they would compensate the owners. They'd buy the slaves from the owners and then transport them to Liberia. As I say, it's a modern nation. It's still there today. Its capital is Monrovia. It was named Monrovia after President James Monroe. So there are two world capitals named after former U.S. presidents, Washington, D.C. and Monrovia, Liberia. The slaves who were relocated there were taken into part of Africa where there were already some people living. And these Americans just came over and brought a bunch of slaves with them and located them there and put them in and established the country of Liberia. And the country of Liberia has been run ever since by the descendants of those ex-slaves. And modern-day Liberia has had some very serious internal disputes. They've had civil wars within the last decade or two in Liberia because forever the people who were sort of the ruling elite were the descendants of the ex-slaves brought to Africa by Americans, and then the descendants of people who were already there, sort of the native Africans, if you want to call them that. And the power and the wealth in the country has been in the hands of the ex-slaves, and there's a lot of resentment over that. There's been very serious political disputes. There's been civil war in Liberia because of the historical situation, which is still going on.